In this video, we're going to use our newly found table view skills to build a times table app, which will use a slider to allow the user to select a times table from 1 to 20, and then they'll be shown the first 50 numbers in that times table on the table view. I'd imagine a young person using that to learn their times tables, or perhaps a teacher using it to test their students. So the one aspect of that we haven't worked with so far is the slider. So before I challenge you to go and create the app, I'm just going to show you how sliders work in a new project. So this will be our times tables app. Sliders are a really great user interface element. They're fun to use and very easy to integrate into your apps. So here we go. So we'll just drag the slider in and I'm going to drag it to the edges of the screen. Sliders typically go from 0 to 1, and you can set the value as being the starting value. So if you set it as 0.2, for example, then it would start off down there. So they're pretty easy to use. I'm just going to quickly set up an IB action for our slider. Just make sure I had that selected. Control drag, and then we want an action. And this action will happen whenever the slider value has changed. There we go. And generally what we want is the slider value when it's been changed. So we need to create another, this time outlet, which I'm just going to call slider. There we go. So if we want to get the slider value when it's changed, we just do something like print slider dot value. Simple as that. And then let's just have a quick look at that in action. So we should find now that when we move the slider up and down, we're given a value in the console between 0 and 1. Just while that's compiling, I'll show you the one other new thing that we'll need, and that is that we'll need to update the table data every time the slider is moved. And that's not something we've seen how to do before, but it's really easy. All we need to do is, once we've created an IB outlet for the table, we use table and then reload data like that. So I don't have my table yet, so you'll have to do that aspect. But when you get there, just use table.reload data to update your table data. So let's have a look. I think we're up and running. There we go. So as I move the slider, you can see we've got a digital value down there. It's essentially 0, and up the top, it's 1. Simple as that. So that's how we use sliders. So your challenge then is to have a slider and a table view, and we want the slider to allow the user to choose between the first 20 times tables and then the first 50 values of whichever times table they select should be displayed on the table below. Best of luck. Go for it. All right then, here we go. I'm just going to delete the slider and the outlet so that we can completely start from scratch. And we'll begin by re-adding our slider, which will be more or less where it was before, at the top of the screen. And I'm going to stretch it to the blue labels and set the constraints to be left, right, and top, which is blue, so we're looking good. In fact, I'll check the layout after I've added the table in. So now, here we go. So we'll drag in the table view and we'll put it just underneath the slider and stretch it out to the edges of the screen. And this time we'll set the constraints all the way around, so it should be effectively full screen, filling up the rest of the screen below the slider. Let's just have a quick look. Yep, that's looking good in other orientations. Brilliant on the iPad as well. Fantastic. Okay. So now let's set up our table view. Deep breath. You should be an expert at this by now. So let's add in a prototype cell. And then we'll add the reuse identifier for that cell. Then we'll control drag to set up outlets for the data source and the delegate. Okay. While we're still on main storyboard, I'll just set up our outlets. We could do without that for now. So we'll need an outlet for the slider and also an action for the slider, which will be called when the slider is changed. And this time as well, because we're going to need to reload the table data, we'll need an outlet for the table. And I'm just going to make sure I've got the table view selected and not one of the cells. That's easily done. So I'll just call that table. Okay, now we need to set up the rest of the table. So let's add in our other types here. So UI table view data source and UI table view delegate. And then it's the data source where we command click, copy the necessary code. There really is no substitute for doing this several times until it's absolutely clear in your mind how to set up a table. There we go. Now we've got our methods. And I always like to have a very simple setup with tables. Initially, just to make sure that everything's connected up nicely before I do anything complicated. So let's create our cell. That's a UI table view cell, which is going to have a style and an identifier. So the style is going to be UI table view cell style dot default, and the reuse identifier is cell. And for now, we'll set the text label, which is an optional, dot text, to, let's just have, hi there. And then we'll return the cell. And then we'll update the types of these methods to internal to avoid that message. And finally, I will just print the slider value when the slider's moved, just so I can check that the slider is set up as well as the table. All right, so that was a fairly whistle-stop tour through creating a table, but we should be pretty happy with that by now. And we should now have our slider, which prints its value to the console when it's moved, and a table with a single row, which has a value of hi there at the top. Excellent. So the table's looking good. Let's have a look. Excellent. The slider's working as well. Fabulous. So now it's just a matter of displaying the right times table in the table itself. So first off, we wanted the first 50 items in the times table, so let's change that to return 50. And now let's think about what we want the text to be. So we can use indexPath.row again. And we're going to need to +1 to it because we want the first row of the table to be 1 rather than 0, multiplied by whatever times table we're displaying. And then we need to get the value of the slider. So we want slider.value, and we essentially want to multiply that by the indexPath.row +1. But remember, the slider value is between 0 and 1, and we want to have timetables from 1 to 20. So let's multiply the slider value by 20. Don't, strictly speaking, need the brackets there, but I like to separate out. So we're taking the slider value, multiplying it by 20, and then multiplying that by the row number, essentially. And of course, that's all an integer. So we need to convert that to a string for the cell text label. All right, let's just give that a try and see what happens with that. You can probably anticipate a couple of problems we're going to have, but let's see it in action before we fix those. Aha! So we have an error here because we're trying to multiply a float, which is the slider value, by an int, which is the indexPath.row +1. So as it happens, we want to make the slider value multiplied by 20 an integer anyway. So let's just use int to convert that to an integer, and then we should have two integers multiplied together, which shouldn't give us an error. So this will round the slider value multiplied by 20 down to the nearest whole number, which is indeed what we want. And here we go. We're looking good. So we've got the 10 times table there, all the way up to 500. And if we move the slider, there's one thing I've forgotten. And that is, of course, to reload the table data. So that's now going to reload the table data with the new slider value. So it's a very lean code base that we've got here. We don't need much code to run something that's reasonably complex. All right, here we go. Let's try it out. There we go. So 12, 13. Excellent. Okay, all the way up to 20. Wonderful. And then if we go the other way, go all the way down to 0. So that's the only problem really that remains. We don't really want to show the 0th times table. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So the easiest way to fix that is to go back over to main storyboard and set a minimum value for the slider, which we did see here. So at the moment, the minimum value is 0. We want the minimum value when it's multiplied by 20 to be 1, because we want 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to be the smallest times table. So we need to do 1 divided by 20 here, which is 0.05. So that should set the minimum value of the slider big enough so that we never get the 0th times table. All right, let's check it out. So now still working fine. We've still got up to 20. But when we take it the other way, with any luck, there we go. It doesn't go any lower than the 1 times table. So now we have all our times tables from 1 up to 20 and the first 50 values of all of them. Fantastic. I hope you enjoyed that one and that you now feel reasonably confident about including table views in your apps. Tables are something we'll be using again and again in the apps that we make throughout this course. For now though, we're going to move away from tables and look at something else, which is pretty fundamental to app development, and that is permanent data storage within your apps. We'll see how to do that in the next video.